Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The phone call came at 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes before Thomas Webb's shift officially started. He'd been awake since 5 anyway, watching fog press against his kitchen window like something living, something patient. Mr. Webb? Ranger Webb? The woman's voice fractured on his name. They said you're the best. They said if anyone can find her, it's you. Thomas set down his coffee, the ceramic mug clicking against formica in the pre-dawn quiet of his ranger station apartment. His free hand found the edge of the table, fingers spreading flat against the wood grain, grounding himself. A technique his therapist had taught him 3 years ago, after Cascade Ridge. Ma'am, I need you to take a breath and tell me who's missing. Sarah Mitchell, my daughter. The mother's words tumbled out in a desperate cascade. She went hiking Tuesday morning, solo, the Hoh River Trail entrance. She was supposed to call that evening. It's Thursday now. Thursday morning, 72 hours. I read that 72 hours is Mrs. Mitchell. Thomas kept his voice level, professional. The voice that didn't betray the way his pulse had already begun its familiar acceleration. I'm going to find your daughter, but I need specific information. What was Sarah wearing? What equipment did she have? As Mrs. Mitchell talked, red North Face jacket, gray hiking pants, osprey pack, amateur photographer, last Facebook post showed the trailhead at 9:15 a.m. Thomas pulled up the digital topographic map on his desktop, the Hoh Rainforest. Of course, the densest temperate rainforest in North America, where Sitka spruce grew 300 feet tall and Douglas firs had been rooted since before Columbus sailed. Where the canopy grew so thick that noon could feel like dusk. Where the Quinault had marked certain areas as Quadi long before white men drew their park boundaries. Sacred ground, protected ground. Thomas's hand cramped around his pen. He'd stopped writing mid-word. Did Sarah mention any specific destination? Any particular site she wanted to photograph? She said something about an old cedar, a really big one. She'd seen pictures online, thought it would make a good portfolio piece. Mrs. Mitchell's voice tightened. Is that bad? Is that important? Thomas closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw another forest. Different trees, same suffocating green. A place where the air had tasted wrong and the silence had weight. No, Mrs. Mitchell. That's helpful information. He opened his eyes, typed rapid notes. I'm assembling a search team now. We'll find her. After he hung up, Thomas sat motionless in his chair for 30 seconds, counting his breaths. 4 counts in. Hold for 4. 4 counts out. Then he stood, pulled on his olive green uniform and began checking his gear with methodical precision. Garmin GPS unit. Charged. Motorola radio. Channel 6. SAR frequency. First aid kit. Inventory complete. Signal flares. Water purification tablets. Mylar emergency blankets. Paracord. The items his hands knew by muscle memory. The ritual that separated Thomas Webb, the man, from Ranger Webb, the professional. He didn't let himself think about the other items at the bottom of his pack. The sage bundle his grandmother had given him. The small stone with a hole worn through its center. A hagstone, she'd called it. Things that had no place in a National Park Service equipment checklist. Things he'd needed 3 years ago when the forest had shown him its other face. The fog hadn't lifted by the time Thomas reached the Hoh River Trail entrance at 8:30 a.m. If anything, it had thickened, reducing visibility to maybe 40 feet. His Chevy Silverado's headlights carved weak tunnels through the gray as he pulled into the small gravel lot. Sarah Mitchell's car sat alone near the trailhead kiosk, a blue Honda Civic with Seattle plates and a Greenpeace sticker on the rear bumper. Thomas approached it slowly, his boots crunching on gravel that seemed too loud in the muffled morning. Condensation beaded on every surface. The driver's side window showed a streak pattern where someone had wiped away moisture from the inside. She'd slept here that first night, he realized. waiting for morning light. Thomas cupped his hands against the glass and peered inside. A travel mug in the cup holder, a fleece blanket bunched in the back seat, a parking pass on the dashboard stamped 9:07 a.m. October 13th, 73 hours ago. He keyed his radio. Dispatch web, I'm at the Ho River entrance, confirming Mitchell vehicle on site, beginning preliminary trail assessment, over. Static then. Copy web. Team 2 is en route from Forks. ETA 40 minutes. Weather service shows incoming system this afternoon. You've got maybe 6 hours of clear searching. Over. Thomas acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt. 6 hours. In the Ho, that might mean 3 miles of effective coverage. The trail system here spiderwebbed for 17 miles, not counting the dozens of unmarked game trails that spun off into the deep forest. He retrieved his pack from the truck, shrugged it on, adjusted the chest strap. 52 pounds of gear that settled onto his shoulders with familiar weight. Then he approached the trailhead, where a weathered wooden sign proclaimed, Ho River Trail, Hall of Mosses, 0.8 mi, Blue Glacier, 17.3 mi. The trail began between 2 massive Sitka spruces, their trunks wider than his truck. Moss grew in thick carpets up their bark, emerald and chartreuse, and epiphytic ferns sprouted from every horizontal surface. The temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment he passed between them, as if he'd stepped through a threshold. Thomas paused, 1 foot in the forest, 1 still in the parking lot. The silence pressed against his eardrums. No bird calls, no rustle of squirrels in the canopy, just the distant whisper of the Ho River, and beneath that, a stillness that felt too complete. He took out his phone, no signal, as expected, and snapped a photo of the trail entrance, time-stamped for the report. Then he pocketed it and started walking. The Hall of Mosses loop trail was empty. Thomas had expected that. It was Thursday morning in October, well past peak tourism season. But the emptiness felt deliberate somehow, as if the forest had cleared itself of witnesses. He walked slowly, scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. Boot prints appeared occasionally in the soft mud, dozens of them, overlapping, impossible to distinguish one hiker's trail from another. The path was well maintained here, cordoned with split rail fencing to keep tourists on track. Sarah could have stayed on this route, or she could have ventured onto any of the side trails that branched deeper into the rainforest. Thomas stopped at each junction, examining the vegetation for broken stems or disturbed moss. Standard search protocol, but also something else. Looking for the signs his grandmother had taught him to recognize. Unnatural patterns, warnings. At the 0.6 mile mark, he found Sarah's first marker. It was subtle, a small cairn of 3 stones stacked beside the trail, just off the main path where a game trail disappeared into a tunnel of Devil's Club and Salmonberry. Thomas crouched beside it, not touching. Rock cairns weren't unusual. Hikers built them constantly despite park regulations. But something about these stones made his jaw tighten. They'd been arranged in a triangle, points facing inward. And beneath the bottom stone, protected from the mud, was a strip of red fabric. Thomas pulled a latex glove from his pocket, snapped it on, and carefully lifted the fabric. North Face logo. Red polyester. He sealed it in an evidence bag, logged the GPS coordinates, 478607 Degren, 123.99358 Degral W. Sarah had been here, had left a trail marker, but she'd left it pointing inward, into the unmarked section of forest, away from the maintained trail. Thomas straightened, studying the game trail. It was narrow, choked with undergrowth, the kind of path that existed only because Roosevelt elk had walked it for generations. Hikers weren't supposed to leave the marked trails. Sarah Mitchell was an amateur photographer from Seattle, not a wilderness expert. She shouldn't have gone this way, unless she was following something. He keyed his radio. Dispatch web, located evidence at 47.8607, 123.9358. Victim left trail marker indicating off-trail travel, requesting permission to pursue. Over. The response crackled back. Web, Team 2 is still 20 minutes out. Recommend you wait for backup. Over. Thomas looked at his watch. 9:13 a.m. In 6 hours, the storm would arrive. Sarah had been out here for 73 hours minimum. Every minute decreased her chances of survival by measurable percentages. He thought of Mrs. Mitchell's voice on the phone. They said you're the best. Dispatch, beginning pursuit. We'll mark trail for Team 2. Web out. He pulled out his roll of orange flagging tape, tied a strip to a low branch at the game trail entrance, and stepped off the marked path. The forest changed character within 50 yards. On the maintained trail, the Hoh rainforest felt majestic, ancient and vast, but ultimately benign. A cathedral of green where tour groups walked in reverent whispers. But here, in the uncurated wild, it revealed a different nature. Nurse logs as thick as cars decomposed beneath blankets of moss. Sword ferns grew waist-high in impassable thickets. Fallen spruce trunks created barriers that required careful climbing, and every surface dripped with condensation that soaked through Thomas's uniform within minutes. He moved carefully, stopping every 20 yards to tie flagging tape and check his compass. The game trail was barely visible, a slight depression in the undergrowth, a gap in the ferns where something large had recently passed. Elk, probably, or a black bear preparing to den for winter, or Sarah following her camera's viewfinder toward whatever shot she thought she'd found. Thomas paused at a massive Douglas fir, easily 15 feet in diameter, its base fluted and gnarled. The bark showed fresh scarring about 6 feet up, 4 parallel gouges, too deliberate to be accidental. He touched them carefully. Sap still oozed from the wounds, made within the last day or two. Bear marking territory, most likely, but the pattern was wrong. Bears raked downward, leaving vertical scratches. These ran horizontal as if something had dragged its claws sideways across the trunk, as if something had been circling the tree. Thomas's radio crackled. Webb, Team 2 has arrived on site. We're at the trailhead. What's your position? Over. He read off his coordinates, described the terrain. I'm following a game trail bearing approximately northeast. Evidence suggests the victim continued in this direction. Trail is difficult but passable. Over. Copy that. We're organizing gear and will follow your flags. Keep your radio on. Over. Thomas acknowledged and kept moving. The forest's silence remained absolute. No ravens calling, no squirrels chattering. Even the distant sound of the river had faded. The only noise was his own breathing, the scrape of his boots on bark, the rustle of his pack against low-hanging hemlock branches. Then, gradually, he became aware of another sound, or not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound moving through the trees. A pocket of deeper quiet that seemed to shift position around him, staying just at the edge of his perception. He stopped walking, counted his breaths, listened. The silence had texture here. Wait. It pressed against his chest like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a choice, to continue forward or turn back. Thomas had felt this before, 3 years ago at Cascade Ridge, when a routine trail inspection had become something else entirely. When he'd found the hiker, or what was left of him, and the forest had shown its teeth. His hand found the hagstone in his pocket, thumb running over its smooth edges, the hole worn through its center by centuries of water. His grandmother had said such stones let you see true, let you recognize the boundaries between this world and the older one that still existed in places like this, where land had been sacred long before it became a national park. He didn't want to see true. He wanted Sarah Mitchell to be lost but alive, injured but recoverable. He wanted this to be a normal search and rescue, statistics and protocols, a story with a happy ending. But the forest's silence said otherwise. Thomas pulled out his GPS, checked his position. He'd traveled 7 miles from the trailhead, northeast bearing. Elevation gain, 340 feet. He was climbing into the deeper rainforest now, where the old growth dominated and human traffic was measured in hikers per month, rather than per day. Ahead, the game trail split around a massive root system where an ancient spruce had toppled, creating a wall of earth and wood. Thomas circled left, ducked under a curtain of moss, and stopped. A clearing opened before him. Not large, maybe 40 feet across, but perfectly circular. The canopy above had somehow opened, allowing gray morning light to filter down in a diffuse column. And in the center of the clearing stood the cedar. It was enormous, easily 20 feet in diameter at the base, its trunk rising straight and perfect until it disappeared into the fog-shrouded canopy above. The bark was weathered to silver gray, deeply furrowed, and draped with moss that hung like ceremonial robes. The tree had to be over 1,000 years old, possibly 2,000, and Sarah Mitchell's red North Face jacket hung from a branch 8 feet off the ground. Thomas approached the cedar slowly, every sense hyper-alert. The clearing's circle was too perfect, its edges too defined. The undergrowth simply stopped at an invisible line, replaced by a carpet of brown needles and cones, as if the forest itself maintained this space, keeping it clear. "Sarah?" His voice sounded flat in the clearing, lacking resonance. "Sarah Mitchell, this is Park Ranger Webb. If you can hear me, please respond." No answer, just the clearing's oppressive quiet. The jacket hung motionless despite the breeze Thomas could feel moving through the canopy above. He circled the cedar, examining the ground for tracks, for blood, for any sign of struggle or injury. What he found instead were patterns. The cedar's base was surrounded by stones, river rocks each about the size of his fist arranged in concentric circles. 7 circles by his count, each one perfectly spaced from the next. And between the circles, someone had scattered cedar boughs, still green, their arrangement too deliberate to be accidental. Thomas's throat had gone dry. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Webb. I've located the victim's jacket at coordinates 47.8691, 123.9423. Victim not present. Site shows evidence of deliberate arrangement. Requesting immediate backup. Over." Static filled his earpiece for 3 seconds, then, "Webb, Team 2 is approximately 20 minutes from your position. Advise if you need medical evac. Over." "Negative on evac. Victim not present. Just get here. Webb out." He stared at the circles of stones, at the jacket hanging like an offering. This wasn't a bear attack, or a simple case of a hiker getting lost and succumbing to exposure. Sarah had come here deliberately, had arranged these stones with purpose, or someone had arranged them for her. Thomas pulled the hagstone from his pocket, held it up to his right eye, and looked through the natural hole at the clearing. The world shifted. Through the stone, the clearing was no longer empty. Threads of something, not quite visible, not quite invisible, connected the stone circles to the cedar's trunk. They pulsed with a rhythm that matched Thomas's heartbeat, and around the tree's base, shadows moved that had no corresponding source. They circled slowly, methodically, like sharks in dark water. Thomas lowered the stone. The threads vanished. The shadows became just shadows again. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "Some places are older than human understanding. Some places remember themselves." The Quinault knew this. They marked the boundaries for a reason. He approached the jacket carefully, pulled it down from the branch. It was damp but undamaged, no tears or blood. He checked the pockets, found Sarah's phone in the left one, battery dead, a granola bar wrapper, a memory card for a camera, but no camera. Thomas turned in a slow circle, scanning the clearing's perimeter. If Sarah had left her jacket here, if she'd arranged these stones, where had she gone? The circle's edge showed no disturbance, no path leading out. It was as if she'd simply vanished at the cedar's base. No, not vanished. He looked up. The cedar's lower branches began about 15 feet off the ground, too high for a person to reach without climbing gear. But above that, the branches grew thick and strong, creating a ladder of sorts. And in the diffuse light filtering through the fog, Thomas thought he could make out something among the higher branches. A shape that didn't match the tree's organic patterns. A blue fabric that might be an osprey pack. "Damn it, Sarah," he muttered. He radioed his position again, confirmed Team 2's ETA, then began assessing the cedar's bark for climbing routes. The lower trunk was smooth, worn by centuries of weather, offering few handholds. But about 10 feet up, a thick burr provided a decent grip point, and a lateral branch extended within reach. Thomas had free-climbed before, though his training emphasized avoiding it whenever possible. Too many variables, too many ways for a solo rescue to become a double victim situation. But Team 2 was still 15 minutes out, and whatever had happened to Sarah, she'd been in this tree for at least a day. He secured his pack to a lower route, kept only his radio and first aid kit on his belt, and started climbing. The bark was damp and slick beneath his hands. He moved carefully, testing each handhold before committing his weight. The burr supported him. He reached the lateral branch, pulled himself onto it, straddled the wood and paused to catch his breath. From this height, the clearing looked different. The stone circles formed a pattern he hadn't been able to see from ground level. Not just concentric rings, but a spiral that wound inward, tightening as it approached the tree's base. The kind of pattern that appeared in tribal art, in petroglyphs, in the oldest forms of human expression. The kind of pattern that marked sacred geometry. Thomas continued climbing. The branches grew closer together here, creating a natural ladder. 15 feet, 20. The ground receded below, and the canopy closed in above. He climbed into a world of green twilight, where perspective became relative and direction lost meaning. At 30 feet, he found the pack. It was wedged between two branches, positioned with obvious intent rather than random chance. Thomas secured himself with one arm around the trunk and reached for the pack with his free hand. The Osprey logo was faded, but readable. He unzipped the main compartment carefully. Inside, a water bottle half full. Energy bars, some eaten. A rain shell. A first aid kit, unused. And at the bottom, carefully wrapped in a dry bag, a Canon DSLR camera. Thomas pulled out the camera, turned it on. The battery indicator showed 20%. He navigated to the photo gallery and started scrolling through the images. The first dozen showed standard tourist shots. The Ho River Trail, moss-draped trees, the majestic scale of the ancient forest. Then the images changed. Sarah had ventured off trail, following the game trail Thomas had traced. The timestamps showed Tuesday afternoon, October 13th. 2:43 p.m., 3:17 p.m., 4:02 p.m. Then, at 4:38 p.m., she'd found the clearing. The first photos of the cedar were respectful, artistic, composition carefully framed, light measured. But as Thomas scrolled forward, the images became stranger. Sarah had photographed the tree's base from multiple angles, and in each shot, barely visible in the shadows, were the stone circles. But in these photos taken 2 days ago, the circles were different, incomplete. Only 3 rings instead of 7. Thomas's hands tightened on the camera. Sarah hadn't found the circles. She'd started building them. He scrolled forward. More photos, timestamps advancing. 5:19 p.m., 6:03 p.m., the light failing, the images growing darker. Sarah had kept photographing, and now the shots showed the circles expanding. 4 rings, 5. Each new photo documented their growth. At 7:47 p.m., well after sunset, the last photo appeared. It showed the clearing in complete darkness, illuminated only by the camera's flash. 7 stone circles, complete. Cedar boughs scattered between them, and standing in the center, facing the camera with her back to the cedar's trunk, was Sarah Mitchell. Her eyes were open, her expression was calm, and her hands were raised, palms facing outward, as if presenting herself, or as if being positioned. Behind her, barely visible in the flash's harsh light, shadows stood among the trees at the clearing's edge. They had the vertical proportions of human figures but lacked definition, as if they were shapes cut from the fabric of darkness itself. The next photo was black. The one after that showed only static. The camera had kept running, kept trying to capture images, but it recorded nothing except digital noise. Until the final image, time-stamped 3:14 a.m., October 14th. It showed the clearing from above, from high in the cedar's canopy, looking down on the stone circles, the scattered boughs, the perfect geometry of the sacred space, from exactly where Thomas was sitting right now. If this story is holding your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Thomas's situation? Share your thoughts. His hands were shaking. He nearly dropped the camera. Someone, or something, had taken this photo, had climbed into this tree carrying Sarah's camera, had positioned itself in this exact spot, and had photographed the clearing below, and then had left the camera here, waiting for Thomas to find it. A sound reached him through the fog. Voices, distant, but growing closer. Team 2, following his flagging tape through the forest. Maybe 5 minutes away now. Thomas secured the camera in his jacket, started to descend, and stopped. Below him, the clearing had changed. The stone circles were moving, not rolling, not tumbling, but shifting position as if manipulated by invisible hands. They contracted inward, ring by ring, tightening their spiral around the cedar's base. And as they moved, the shadows at the clearing's edge grew more distinct. They emerged from between the trees, becoming more solid, more defined. They had the shape of people, but they were too tall, too thin. Their proportions were wrong. They moved without disturbing the undergrowth, without making sound, circling the clearing's perimeter in a slow, patient procession. Thomas had seen them before. At Cascade Ridge 3 years ago, when he'd found the hiker who'd ignored the warning signs and crossed into forbidden territory. When Thomas had gone after him and nearly hadn't come back. His therapist had said they were hallucinations, stress-induced breaks from reality, the trauma response of a mind trying to process something impossible. Thomas had almost believed her, but the cameras at Cascade Ridge had captured them too, in the moments before the equipment failed. Shapes that shouldn't exist, moving through a world that operated by different rules. The Kano called them Spipek, the guardians, the watchers, the ones who enforced the boundaries that human law couldn't recognize. One of the shadows stopped moving. It turned, looked up, and Thomas felt its attention focus on him like the beam of a searchlight. It had no face, no features, but he knew it saw him, recognized him, and dismissed him. Because Thomas wasn't the trespasser, Sarah was, and she'd known exactly what she was doing. The radio crackled. "Webb, we see your flags. Estimate 3 minutes to your position. Over." Thomas keyed the mic with trembling hands. "Copy. I'm in the tree. Found the victim's camera and pack. Evidence suggests..." He stopped. How could he explain this in a way that made sense? "Evidence suggests ritualistic behavior. Advise extreme caution upon approach. Over." Ritualistic? "Webb, please clarify." Over. But Thomas couldn't answer because below him, the shadows had finished their circle. They stood evenly spaced around the clearing's edge, 7 figures corresponding to the 7 stone rings, and as he watched, they began to move inward, walking in synchronized steps toward the cedar's trunk. The stone circles responded. Each ring lifted, impossible but undeniable, hovering 6 inches off the ground. They began to rotate, counterclockwise, each ring spinning at a different speed. The cedar boughs scattered between them lifted too, caught in some invisible current, circling the tree like leaves in a whirlwind. Thomas pulled out the hagstone, looked through it. Through the stone's hole he could see what the shadows were protecting, or what they were feeding. The cedar's trunk pulsed with light that existed outside the visible spectrum. Threads extended from its heartwood, connecting to every tree in the clearing, to every stone, to every living thing. But they also extended down, deep into the earth, where something vast and ancient maintained its presence. A consciousness that predated human thought, a guardian that had been here for millennia, marking this place as its own. And Sarah Mitchell, volunteer offering or ignorant trespasser, had walked into its territory and built an altar with her own hands. The camera she'd left behind was a confession, a documentation of her acceptance, or her apology. Thomas understood now why the search had been so easy, why he'd found markers showing exactly where Sarah had gone, why she'd left her jacket hanging like a flag. She'd wanted to be found, but not rescued. Thomas Webb, The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, not sound waves traveling through air, but meaning injected directly into his consciousness. It resonated in his bones, in the spaces between his thoughts. He'd heard it before, at Cascade Ridge, in the moment before he'd fled and left the other hiker behind. "You know the boundaries," the voice continued. "You were marked. You were warned. You do not belong here, but you may leave." Thomas's mouth was dry. He managed to force words out. "Sarah Mitchell, the woman who came here. I need to take her back." The shadows stopped moving. The stone circles ceased their rotation, settling back to the ground with absolute silence. Even the wind in the canopy stilled. She came willingly. She heard the call and answered. She completed the circle. "The debt is satisfied." "Debt?" Thomas's voice cracked. "What debt?" "She's a photographer from Seattle. She didn't know. Her grandfather knew." The voice was patient, implacable. "He logged these mountains in 1962. He took trees that were marked as sacred. He was warned." He continued. "The debt comes due." Thomas closed his eyes, felt the cedar's bark solid beneath his hands, felt the 30 feet of air between him and the ground, felt the weight of understanding settle into his chest like a stone. Sarah's last Instagram post, the one Mrs. Mitchell had mentioned. She'd written about connecting with her heritage, about following family history, about making amends. She'd known, maybe not consciously, maybe just following an inherited guilt her rational mind couldn't name, but she'd known. "The woman who bore her made the call," the voice said. "She asked you to find her daughter. You have found her. Tell the one who bore her that the daughter paid what was owed. Tell her to mark this place as forbidden. Tell her the boundaries hold." "Where is she?" Thomas demanded. "Where is Sarah? Where all offerings go? Where the debt is paid? She nourishes the roots. She becomes part of the cycle. She is honored." The voices of Team 2 crashed through the forest, loud and human and impossibly out of place. "Webb! Webb! Where are you?" Thomas looked down. The clearing was empty again. The stone circles lay motionless on the ground. The shadows had vanished. Everything looked exactly as it had when he'd first arrived, except for one detail. A 7th stone circle had appeared, this one glittering slightly in the dim light. He squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing, then realized they weren't stones. They were teeth. Human teeth, arranged in a perfect circle around the cedar's base. "Up here!" Thomas shouted, his voice breaking. "In the tree!" The official report listed Sarah Mitchell as missing, presumed deceased, body not recovered, cause of disappearance, unknown. The investigation remained open pending discovery of remains or new evidence. Thomas submitted his statement, turned in the camera and the jacket, and accepted the mandatory psychological evaluation that followed any failed search and rescue operation. He answered the therapist's questions carefully, describing what he'd found without mentioning the shadows, the moving stones, the voice that had spoken to him in the tree. He'd learned at Cascade Ridge that some truths couldn't be shared, that the world ran on comfortable lies, and his job was to maintain those lies even when they choked him. Mrs. Mitchell called him once, 2 weeks after the search ended. He'd expected anger, accusations of incompetence. Instead, she'd thanked him. "Sarah left me a note," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I found it in her apartment, in an envelope marked, 'If something happens.' She said she had to make things right, that her grandfather had done something terrible, and it was her responsibility to fix it." Thomas listened, the phone pressed against his ear, staring out his kitchen window at the fog that never quite lifted from the Olympic Mountains. "She wrote that she knew the risks," Mrs. Mitchell continued, "that if she didn't come back, I should tell everyone she'd died doing something meaningful, that she'd chosen her path." A long pause. "Did she, Mr. Webb? Did she choose?" Thomas thought about the photos on Sarah's camera, the careful documentation of her work, the final image of her standing calm and accepting, hands raised, facing what came for her. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I believe she did." After the call ended, Thomas drove back to the Hoh River Trail entrance. He parked in the empty lot, walked to the trailhead, and stood between the two massive Sitka spruces that marked the boundary. The forest's silence was absolute. He pulled out a piece of paper and a marker from his truck, wrote in large block letters, "Trail closed. Hazardous conditions." Then he zip-tied the sign to the kiosk, knowing it wouldn't last long, knowing hikers would ignore it or park rangers would remove it. But he'd tried. He'd marked the boundary just as he'd been told to. As he turned back toward his truck, something caught his eye. A small cairn of 3 stones, arranged in a triangle beside the trail. Beneath it, a strip of red fabric. Thomas stared at it for a long moment. Then he climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The fog pressed against his windshield like something patient, like something that knew he'd be back. Because there would be another call eventually. Another missing hiker. Another desperate family. Another person who crossed a boundary they didn't know existed, into territory that enforced its own laws. And Thomas Webb, marked at Cascade Ridge and spared in the cedar clearing, would answer that call. Would follow the flags and markers deeper into the forest. Would document and report and maintain the comfortable lies. Because someone had to stand at the boundary. Someone had to bear witness. Even when the weight of witnessing broke you, piece by piece, truth by buried truth. The Olympic Mountains rose in his rearview mirror, their peaks lost in clouds that never cleared. And somewhere in those mountains, in a clearing he could never unsee, an ancient cedar stood guardian over debts paid and boundaries kept. Sarah Mitchell had become part of the forest, part of the cycle. Part of the old knowledge that existed before park boundaries and trail signs and human law. Thomas knew he'd dream about her tonight, would see her standing in the clearing, calm and accepting, would hear the voice that was not a voice, explaining the rules of a world that existed alongside his own, separate but touching. Would wake at 3:14 a.m. and wonder if somewhere, something was taking photographs. He drove on through the fog, toward the ranger station, toward his next shift, toward the next call that would inevitably come. The boundary held, for now. The end. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more immersive stories. What's your interpretation of Sarah's fate? Willing sacrifice or tragic victim? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The phone call came at 4:47 a.m., when the darkness outside David's ranger station still held the particular weight that comes before dawn. He'd been awake anyway. He was always awake at this hour, had been for 3 years, sitting at his desk with cold coffee and incident reports he'd read a dozen times before. "Please," the woman's voice cracked through the static. "Please, you have to find her. The other rangers, they say to wait, but it's been 36 hours. 36 hours and she's out there alone and..." David recognized the sound. Desperation had a specific frequency, one that bypassed the ear entirely and went straight to whatever part of the brain stored its own worst memories. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down. Tell me your daughter's name." "Emily. Emily Catherine Morrison. She's 22. She's doing her graduate research on old-growth ecosystems. She's so smart, she's so careful, she wouldn't just..." The words dissolved into something wordless. David pulled up the missing persons report on his computer, even though he already knew what it would say. The Hoh Rainforest. Of course it was the Hoh, somewhere east of the main trail, near where Glacier Creek split into dozens of unnamed tributaries. Near where the Sitka spruces grew so dense that GPS signals fractured into useless noise. Near where Marcus had died. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to find your daughter." The words came automatically, the promise every ranger made even when they knew better, especially when they knew better. "Can you tell me exactly where Emily was conducting her research?" The mother's breathing steadied slightly, clinging to the procedural questions like they were solid ground. "She sent me coordinates. She was so excited. She'd found one of the oldest Sitka spruces in the rainforest. maybe 500 years old. She said there were markings on it, patterns she'd never seen before. Probably from the Kino people, she thought. She wanted to document them, take samples from the surrounding soil composition. Her advisor approved the site last month. David's hand stopped moving across his notepad. Markings. What kind of markings? I don't know. She texted me a photo, but the service was terrible out there. It looked like, I don't know, symbols, carved deep into the bark. She said they looked recent, which was strange because the tree was so old. That was her last message. That was 2 days ago. He pulled up Emily's file photo. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Serious eyes behind frameless glasses. The kind of focused expression that came from someone who preferred microscopes to people. Young. Too young to understand that some places earned their silence for a reason. I'll head out at first light, David said. I'll call you as soon as I have anything. After he hung up, he sat in the pre-dawn darkness for another 7 minutes. Through the window, the western edge of the Olympic Mountains emerged from shadow, the same mountains that had watched him carry Marcus's body out 3 years ago, the same mountains that had listened to his screaming explanations that no one believed, that he eventually stopped believing himself. Dehydration, they'd said. Acute stress reaction. Grief-induced psychosis. But David remembered the warnings, the way the forest had changed in the hours before they found Marcus. How the birds had gone silent in a spreading circle, like something was displacing them. How the moss had looked wrong, the patterns disrupted in ways his eyes registered but his brain couldn't process. How Marcus had insisted they were being followed, not by an animal, but by an absence, a hole in the world that moved. David stood, pulled his gear from the locker. Water, first aid, GPS unit and backup compass, topographic maps printed on waterproof paper, marked with his own notations from dozens of searches, satellite phone with a battery that would last 3 days if he was careful, a rain jacket that had saved his life twice and failed him once. At 6:15 a.m., with dawn turning the mist to gold, he drove the service road as far as it went, then stepped into the Hoh rainforest for the first time since Marcus. The temperate rainforest swallowed sound the way deep water did, muffling everything to a dense organic quiet, broken only by the constant drip of moisture from leaves that never fully dried. The trail was well maintained for the first mile, wide enough for tourists to walk two abreast, marked with interpretive signs about Roosevelt elk and old-growth ecology. David left the main trail at 7:43 a.m. The GPS coordinates Mrs. Morrison had provided led northeast into a section of the rainforest where the map showed nothing but contour lines and unnamed waterways. He'd studied this area before, after Marcus, had marked it on his personal maps with notations he'd never shared with anyone. Elk avoid after dusk. Raven colonies abandoned 2009. No coherent radio transmission past mile marker 3. The forest changed as he walked. Not dramatically, nothing any casual hiker would notice. But David had spent 15 years reading the subtle alphabets of wilderness, and he could see the sentences forming. The nurse logs, those massive fallen trees that hosted entire ecosystems in their decomposition, all oriented the same direction, northeast to southwest, as if they'd fallen in a pattern rather than at random. The sword ferns grew thicker than normal, their fronds reaching toward the trail like hands, and the silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a forest going about its business. It was the held-breath silence that came before something broke. At 9:20 a.m., he found Emily's base camp. She'd set up a professional operation, a small weatherproof tent staked securely, research equipment arranged on a folding table under a tarp, sample containers labeled with date and GPS coordinates, a camp stove with a full fuel canister, food supplies sealed against animals. Everything organized with the kind of methodical care that came from someone who understood wilderness protocol. Everything except Emily herself. David approached slowly, calling her name, already knowing she wouldn't answer. He'd done this before. The empty camp, the abandoned gear, the sense of something fundamentally wrong in the negative space where a person should be. Her research notebook lay open on the table, protected from the constant mist by the tarp. David pulled on gloves, habit from years of treating every scene as potential evidence, and read her last entry. October 14th, 2015, 3:47 p.m. The Sitka spruce is even more remarkable than I thought. Estimated age, 480, 520 years. Circumference, 58 feet. Height, approximately 270 feet, though the canopy makes precise measurement difficult. But it's the markings that I can't explain. They're not historical carvings. The wood is too fresh, the sap still tacky in the deepest grooves. Someone cut these within the last year, maybe less. But the patterns, they don't match any canal symbolism I've studied. They're more like warnings. The same symbol repeated in a spiral pattern around the base. A circle with lines radiating outward, like a child's drawing of the sun, but wrong somehow. Inverted. The strangest part, the forest around this tree is different. No seedlings within 30 feet of the trunk. The moss grows in a perfect circle, then stops, as if something is keeping the area clear. I should document this more thoroughly tomorrow. Right now, I just want to... The entry stopped mid-sentence. David looked up from the notebook, following the direction Emily must have been facing when she wrote. Through the cathedral of ancient trees, perhaps 200 yards distant, he could see it. A Sitka spruce that dwarfed everything around it. Its trunk so massive it seemed less like a tree and more like a wall of living bark rising into the canopy. Even from here he could see the markings. They covered the lower 20 feet of the trunk in concentric circles, exactly as Emily had described. Deep cuts that wept sap, fresh enough that the exposed wood hadn't yet darkened. And they were moving. No, not moving. His eyes were moving, following the spiral pattern inward, and his brain was interpreting the static carvings as motion. An optical illusion, nothing more. David closed his eyes, counted to 5, opened them again. The patterns were still there, still carved, still definitely, absolutely not moving. He keyed his radio. "Base, this is Ranger Morrison, come in." Static. He checked the battery. Full charge. Checked the frequency. Correct. Tried again. "Base, this is David Morrison in Sector 7 North requesting comm check." Nothing but the soft hiss of dead air. David switched to the satellite phone. The screen showed 4 bars of signal, but when he tried to dial, the call dropped immediately. He tried 3 more times with 3 different numbers. Same result. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in David's situation? Share your thoughts below. He was alone, 30 miles from the nearest road, in a forest that was behaving exactly the way it had behaved 3 years ago, looking for a missing person near a tree that felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, but absolutely recognized. David checked his compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to find north. "Okay," he said aloud, because the sound of his own voice was better than the silence. "Okay, this is fine. This is just magnetic interference from the volcanic rock, perfectly normal geological phenomenon." The needle stopped spinning, pointing directly at the marked tree. David had 2 choices. He could walk back to his truck, drive to the main station, file a report that would make him sound insane, and wait for a proper search team that would arrive in 12 to 24 hours. Or he could walk toward that tree, toward whatever had taken Emily, toward the thing he'd been running from for 3 years. He thought of Mrs. Morrison's voice on the phone. He thought of Emily's careful handwriting in the research notebook. He thought of Marcus, who had followed him into this same forest because David had been too confident, too certain that he understood how the wilderness worked. He checked his pack, adjusted his jacket, made sure his utility knife was accessible in his right pocket, even though he had no idea what he thought he'd use it against. Then he walked toward the tree. The forest resisted him, not obviously. There were no supernatural barriers, no invisible walls. But the ground was wrong. The spaces between the nurse logs were narrower than they should be, forcing him to squeeze through gaps that looked wider from a distance. Branches hung lower than they had moments before, catching his pack, slowing his progress. The mist thickened into something that wasn't quite fog, wasn't quite rain, but obscured his vision past 20 feet in any direction. and the silence had ended. Now the forest was full of sound, but all of it wrong. Branches snapping in no wind, the rush of water from streams that weren't on his map, and voices, not words exactly, but the cadence of human speech, coming from a dozen different directions. Conversations happening just out of earshot, the way you might hear your neighbors through apartment walls. "Emily!" David's voice came out hoarse. He tried again, louder. "Emily Morrison, can you hear me?" The forest swallowed his words, gave nothing back. It took him 40 minutes to cover 200 yards. When he finally reached the marked tree, his watch read 10:05 a.m., but the light had the quality of late afternoon, golden and slanted and wrong for the season. The Sitka spruce was older than his country. It had been a seedling when Columbus sailed, had weathered 5 centuries of storms that would have flattened cities. The trunk was so wide that 10 people holding hands couldn't have circled it. The bark was deeply furrowed, textured like muscle. And carved into that bark, spiraling from ground level up past where David could see, were the symbols. Emily had been right. They weren't traditional indigenous markings. They were too regular, too precise, the kind of thing made with modern tools but following some ancient logic. The pattern repeated, a circle with 8 radiating lines rotated and inverted, then repeated. Again and again spiraling upward. David had seen these symbols before. 3 years ago, carved into trees surrounding the clearing where he'd found Marcus. He'd told the investigation team about them, but when they'd returned to the site, the carvings were gone, or had never been there. That part was unclear, lost in the fog of his breakdown. He reached out to touch one of the symbols. "I wouldn't," a voice said. David spun, hand going to his knife. A man stood 20 feet away, somehow present in a space that had been empty seconds before. He was old, 70s at least, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades outdoors. He wore modern hiking clothes, expensive technical fabric, but carried himself with an unself-conscious ease in the wilderness that money couldn't buy. "Who are you?" David kept his hand on the knife. "Name's Joseph Black Elk, and you're David Morrison, the ranger who lost his partner here 3 years ago." It wasn't a question. "You're looking for the college girl, Emily. You know where she is?" Joseph moved closer, and David could see his eyes were the color of cedar bark, brown shot through with red. "Wrong question. Better question is, do you know where you are?" "The Hoh Rainforest, Sector 7 North. This tree is 512 years old, give or take a season." Joseph gestured at the massive Sitka spruce. "My grandmother's grandmother told her the stories passed down. This was a gathering place, a sacred grove where the Kino people came for vision quests. The tree was already ancient then, already had a guardian." David felt his jaw tighten. "I don't have time for folklore. You think this is folklore?" Joseph's voice didn't rise, but something in it made David step back. "Your partner thought the same thing. The girl thought the same thing. Everyone thinks their science, their understanding of how forests work is complete. That there's nothing in the Olympic Mountains that biology textbooks haven't explained." He pointed at the carvings. "These are warnings. We carved them 60 years ago when the logging companies came too close. We carved them again 30 years ago when the park expanded and the hikers started coming. We carved them again 3 years ago, after your partner died. And we'll carve them again after you if you don't listen." Warnings against what? Against disturbing what shouldn't be disturbed. Against taking from what shouldn't be taken from. Against assuming that just because this land is in a park with trails and ranger stations, it's been made safe. Joseph moved to the base of the tree, placed his palm against the bark between 2 symbols. "The guardian has been here longer than the tree, longer than my people. It protects this grove because something happened here, something we don't have words for, something that needs protecting." David's radio crackled to life. Through heavy static, he heard Emily's voice. "Please, someone, I'm trapped. Can't find the way." He grabbed the radio. "Emily! Emily, what's your location?" "The tree. I'm at the tree. I can see the markings." Her voice dissolved into static, then reformed. "Can't leave. Every direction I walk just brings me back." Joseph shook his head slowly. She took samples. Soil, bark, moss. She took from the grove without permission, without understanding. The Guardian won't let her leave until she returns what was taken. That's insane. She's a scientist doing research approved by the Park Service. The Guardian doesn't recognize Park Service jurisdiction. Joseph's voice was flat, stating a fact. It was here first. It'll be here last. Your permits mean nothing. David's mind raced through possibilities. Hypothermia could cause confusion, disorientation. So could dehydration, shock, a dozen other medical emergencies. Emily was out here somewhere, actually lost, and this old man was feeding him ghost stories while she died of exposure. Except his compass still pointed at the tree. His radio still didn't work except for Emily's voice. And 3 years ago, Marcus had died in this same forest, in this same impossible way. How do I find her? David asked. You don't. The Grove has her. The only question is whether you join her or whether you leave now and survive. That's not an option. It's always an option. I've been coming here for 53 years, leaving offerings, showing respect. I've never tried to take anything from this place. That's why I can leave. Joseph started walking away, then paused. Your partner? He was trying to protect you. The Grove took him instead because he was closer. The Guardian can be negotiated with, but it requires understanding what you're asking and what you're willing to pay. David watched the old man disappear into the mist. Then he looked at the tree, at the spiraling warnings carved into living wood. Emily's voice came through the radio again. So cold, why is it so cold? He made his decision. David circled the tree, looking for an opening, a gap in the symbols, some indication of where to begin. The carvings were perfectly uniform, showing no obvious entry point. But as he moved clockwise around the massive trunk, the quality of light changed. Shadows fell differently, despite the even overcast of the rainforest canopy. On the northeastern side of the tree, the symbols stopped. Not gradually, they simply ended, as if whoever had been carving had reached this point and decided the warning was complete. The bark here was smooth, unscarred, different from the deeply furrowed texture everywhere else. And at the base, barely visible beneath the moss and duff, was an opening. Not a hollow in the tree, but a gap in the forest floor itself. A space where the earth had pulled back from the roots, creating a cavity that descended into darkness. The opening was perhaps 3 feet wide, just large enough for a person to squeeze through. David pulled out his flashlight, shined it into the gap. The beam penetrated about 10 feet before being absorbed by absolute darkness. He could see roots disappearing downward, gnarled and thick as his leg. The smell rising from the opening was rich with decomposition and something else, a mineral scent, like the air after lightning strikes. Emily, he called down. Emily, if you can hear me, make noise. For a moment, nothing. Then distantly, an echo that might have been a human voice. Every part of David's training said not to enter an unmapped cavity alone, without backup, without proper equipment, or someone topside to monitor. He should mark the location, return to base, bring a technical rescue team with ropes and lights and communication equipment that actually worked. But he thought of Emily's research notebook, her careful notes, the way her mother's voice had broken on the phone. He thought of Marcus, who had followed him into danger because David had been too confident, who had died while David had been too slow to understand the warnings. He secured his pack, made sure his flashlight was tethered to his wrist, and lowered himself into the opening. The roots provided natural handholds, a ladder descending into the earth. The passage was tight enough that his shoulders scraped both sides, tight enough that he had to exhale to slide through certain sections. The temperature dropped as he descended, the air becoming noticeably cooler, damper. His flashlight beam showed root-woven walls, earth packed solid by centuries of growth. After approximately 30 feet, though distance was hard to judge in the confined space, the passage opened into a chamber. David emerged into a space perhaps 15 feet across, the ceiling high enough to stand. The walls were entirely roots, woven so densely they formed a solid structure. They pulsed, not with any rhythm he could time, but with a slow, organic movement that suggested the tree above was breathing. In the center of the chamber, Emily sat with her back against a column of roots. "Emily." David rushed forward, dropped to his knees beside her. She was alive. He could see her breathing, see the rise and fall of her chest. But her eyes were closed, her face pale, her skin cold to the touch. He checked her pulse, steady but slow. No obvious injuries, no blood, nothing to explain her unconsciousness. Around her, arranged in a careful circle, were her sample containers. The soil samples, the moss, the bark scrapings, everything she'd taken from the grove, returned. But not in the containers. The samples had been removed and spread on the ground, arranged in patterns that echoed the symbols carved above. "Emily, can you hear me?" David gently shook her shoulder. "I'm Ranger Morrison. I'm here to take you home." Her eyes opened, but they didn't focus on him. They stared past him at something behind his shoulder. David turned. The roots on the far wall had parted, revealing a figure. No, not a figure. A presence. Something that used the shape of roots and earth and living wood to approximate human form, the way a child might stack rocks and call it a person. It was roughly 8 feet tall, broader than any human, its surface covered in moss and lichen and things that might have been eyes, or might have been knots in the wood. David's training evaporated. Every protocol, every procedure, every ounce of rationality that had sustained him through 15 years of wilderness work, gone. He was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something his brain had no framework to process. The Guardian moved, not by walking, but by reforming itself slightly closer, the roots flowing like water taking a new shape. Emily whispered, "It showed me." David tore his gaze from the Guardian. "Showed you what?" "What grows here? Underground, the network." Her voice was dreamy, disconnected. The roots of every tree in the rainforest, they're all connected, all talking to each other, sharing resources, warnings, information. This tree is the oldest, the hub, and the Guardian protects the hub because if this tree dies, the whole network dies. Hundreds of acres, thousands of trees, all dependent on this connection. "Emily, we need to leave." I took from it, I didn't understand, I was just doing research, just taking samples, but every sample is part of the network. Every piece of bark, every handful of soil, it's all connected. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were lucid now, fully present. "It won't let me leave until I understand, until I can promise never to take again." The Guardian moved closer. David could smell it now, earth and sap and the deep organic scent of decomposition that fertilized new growth. It reached out one appendage, something that might have been a hand, toward Emily. David stepped between them. "Wait." His voice shook, but he held his ground. "You want understanding?" "I understand. 3 years ago, my partner died here. I thought it was because we didn't know the trails well enough, didn't respect the danger of the wilderness. But it was this, wasn't it? We took something. We disturbed something. And the Grove took Marcus in payment." The Guardian paused. "I've spent 3 years blaming myself. 3 years thinking I could have saved him if I'd been faster, smarter, better. But I couldn't have saved him because I didn't understand the rules. Nobody told me there were rules beyond the ones in the Ranger manual." David's hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists. Emily didn't know either. She's young, she's trying to learn, trying to understand the world through the only methods she's been taught. You can't punish people for ignorance. The Guardian's presence pressed against him like physical weight. David felt it in his chest, making breathing difficult. His vision narrowed, darkness creeping in from the edges. Then impossibly he heard Marcus's voice. Not from the Guardian, but from everywhere, from the walls themselves. "It's not about punishment. It's about balance." David's knees buckled. He caught himself against the wall, against the roots, and they were warm under his palm, pulsing with that slow tree heartbeat rhythm. "The Grove doesn't understand your science, your research, your need to document and explain. It only understands taking and giving. You took samples. You take understanding. What do you give in return? What do you want?" David's voice came out as a rasp. The Guardian moved again, flowing around him, approaching Emily. It reached down, placed one root hand over her heart. Memory. Emily gasped, her back arching. Her eyes went wide, pupils dilating until the irises were barely visible. For 30 seconds that felt like hours. She convulsed, every muscle rigid. Then she collapsed, breathing hard. "What did you do?" David grabbed her, pulled her away from the Guardian. "What did you do to her?" Emily looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I remember. Oh God, I remember all of it. Every tree in the network, every root, every connection. 500 years of growth and death and growth again. I remember when this tree was a seedling. I remember the people who came before us, who understood how to take without taking too much. I remember Marcus." She sobbed. "He tried to stop them. There were poachers, illegal loggers, and Marcus tracked them here. They were cutting trees inside the protected area. He tried to stop them, and they pushed him, and he fell, and..." David felt the truth settle into his bones. Not psychosis. Not his imagination. Marcus had died protecting this forest from people who didn't understand or didn't care about its sanctity. And the grove had taken his body, his memory, incorporated him into the network. He wasn't gone, he was here. Part of the breathing walls, the living wood. "We give respect," David said, speaking to the Guardian, to Marcus, to the forest itself. "We give understanding. Emily will tell your story. She'll write about the network, about the connections, about why this place needs protection. Not as mythology, but as ecology. She'll make people understand that taking from the forest isn't just wrong. It disrupts something bigger than any individual tree." The Guardian regarded him with those not eyes. David felt it weighing his words, judging their sincerity. Then the roots behind them shifted, creating an opening. Not the passage he'd descended, but a new route, leading upward. "Go. Remember. Protect." David pulled Emily to her feet. She was shaking, leaning heavily against him, but she could walk. He guided her toward the opening, supporting her weight. As they climbed, the roots provided holds exactly where needed, smooth and solid and somehow welcoming. The passage led up at a gentle angle, easy to navigate even in Emily's weakened state. They emerged not at the base of the marked tree, but 100 yards away, near Emily's camp. The light was normal again. Late morning sun filtered through mist. Birds called in the distance. The forest felt like a forest, not a cathedral, not a living entity, just trees and moss and earth. David's radio crackled. "Ranger Morrison, this is Base. We've been trying to reach you for 3 hours. Please respond." He keyed the mic with shaking hands. "Base, this is Morrison. I have Emily Morrison with me. She's alive. We need medical evacuation to her camp coordinates. Over." "Copy that. Medical en route, ETA 45 minutes. What's her condition?" David looked at Emily. She was staring back at the marked tree, visible through the forest, its symbols stark against the bark. "Physically unharmed," he said. "But she's going to need time to process what happened. Over." "Understood. Stay with her until medevac arrives. Base out." Emily turned to him. "They won't believe us." "I know. I have to try anyway. I have to write about this, about what's really happening in these forests. The network, the connections, that's real science. That's ecology we're just beginning to understand. Maybe if I can explain it in terms people accept, they'll understand why some places need to be left alone." David thought about his own report from 3 years ago, how the investigators had looked at him with pity and concern, how his own memories had blurred under their skepticism. "Write about the network," he said. "Write about mycorrhizal connections and chemical signaling and how old-growth forests are single organisms, not collections of trees. That's all true. That's science people can verify. Leave the rest ambiguous. Let them wonder. Sometimes the wondering is enough." They waited together in Emily's camp, neither speaking, listening to the forest breathe. When the helicopter arrived, the medical team examined Emily thoroughly. Mild dehydration, slight hypothermia, nothing that required hospital admission. They wanted to keep her overnight for observation, but she insisted on signing a release. She had work to do. Before she left, she gripped David's hand. "Thank you for coming alone, for understanding. Thank you for being willing to tell the story." He squeezed back. "My partner, Marcus, he'd want people to know, to understand why he stayed." Emily nodded. "I'll make sure they do." 3 weeks later, David received a package at his ranger station. Inside was a draft manuscript, 200 pages, titled The Hidden Network: Mycorrhizal Connections in Old-Growth Sitka Spruce Forests. The paper was brilliant. Detailed analysis of root systems, nutrient sharing, even some speculation about information transfer through chemical signals. Emily had documented the network with scientific precision, making a compelling case for why certain areas of old-growth forest needed absolute protection. On the last page, she'd included a personal note. "David, the scientific community is excited about this research. My advisor says it could revolutionize how we think about forest conservation. Park Service is already implementing new protocols for research permits in sensitive areas. I still remember everything the Grove showed me. I don't think I'll ever forget, but I'm learning to translate it into language people can accept. Science is a bridge between worlds. There's something else. I've been having dreams about Marcus. He says to tell you, you did good. You learned the lesson he couldn't teach you when he was alive. The forest forgives, the grove protects, and some sacrifices become part of something larger. I don't know if that's real or if it's my trauma creating meaning from tragedy. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the story we tell is as important as what actually happened. Take care of yourself. Take care of the forest." Emily David folded the letter carefully, placed it in his desk drawer next to his old reports. Through the window, the Olympic Mountains stood against the sky, ancient and indifferent and somehow watchful. He thought about Marcus, about Emily, about all the people who walked into wilderness believing they understood its rules, about the gaps between what science explained and what science could see. That afternoon, he drove back to the Hoh rainforest, not on official business, just as himself, with nothing but water and respect. He hiked to the marked tree, the one with the spiraling warnings carved into its bark. At its base, he placed 3 items: a photograph of Marcus, a compass that no longer worked properly, and a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for teaching me." The forest accepted his offering. A breeze moved through the canopy, carrying the scent of cedar and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. David walked back to his truck without looking behind him. Some stories ended with understanding, not resolution. Some forests gave back what they took, but in forms too strange to explain in incident reports. He would continue his work. He would tell other rangers about respecting the places between the trails. He would remember that wilderness wasn't waiting to be understood. It was waiting to be witnessed. And on quiet mornings before dawn, when he sat alone with coffee and reports, he would listen to the silence and hear his partner's voice in the breathing of the forest, telling him, "You learned. You protected. That's enough." The end. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of what really happened to Marcus? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The radio crackled at 6:47 a.m., pulling David from a sleep that had never been deep to begin with. 3 years in this tower, and he still woke at every branch snap, every owl call. His hand found the receiver before his eyes fully opened. Ranger Station 7, this is dispatch. We have a code yellow in Sector 12, Hoh River Trail. Female hiker, late 20s, failed to check in at Lake Angeles last night. Family called it in 20 minutes ago. David sat up, already calculating. Sector 12, the old growth section where the cedars stood like cathedral columns and the moss grew thick enough to muffle sound. He'd avoided that area for 2 years. Copy that. Subject name? Sarah Chen, wildlife researcher from UW. She was tracking elk migration patterns. Last confirmed sighting was at the Ho Ranger Station yesterday at 1400 hours. David's pen hovered over his notebook. A researcher, someone who knew the woods, which made this worse. Amateurs got lost because they were careless. Professionals disappeared because something had gone very wrong. Weather conditions? Dense fog rolled in around 1900 last night. Temperature dropped to 34 degrees. Current temp is 36 and holding. He was already pulling on his thermal layer, the motion automatic after 15 years as a ranger. The fabric felt stiff in the cold tower air. Through the window, the forest stretched out in shades of gray and green, the morning fog clinging to the valley like something that didn't want to let go. I'll mobilize from the Ho station, ETA 40 minutes. David packed his gear with practiced efficiency. First aid kit, emergency blanket, flares, GPS unit, the 2015 model that still needed clear sky to get a signal. His fingers paused over the small leather pouch at the bottom of his pack, the one he'd carried for 3 years but never opened. Inside was Sage, blessed by a Kino elder, who'd looked at him with knowing eyes and said, "Some places remember, some things don't leave." He left the pouch where it was. The Ho Ranger Station smelled like coffee and wet wood when David arrived. Ranger Tom Morrison was already there, spreading a topographic map across the table. Tom was younger, mid-30s, with the kind of confidence that came from never having seen anything he couldn't explain with science and common sense. "David, good, you made it?" Tom tapped a red circle on the map. "Sarah checked in here at 2 p.m. yesterday. Told me she was heading up to Elk Lake to check camera traps. Said she'd be back before dark. And she never came out." "Right. Her husband called us at 06:30 this morning. She was supposed to call him last night at 9. When she didn't, he figured maybe the cell signal was bad. When she didn't call this morning either, he drove up from Seattle." David studied the map. The trail from Ho Station to Elk Lake was 8.3 miles, elevation gain of 2,400 feet. In good conditions, an experienced hiker could do it in 4 hours. Sarah would have had plenty of time before sunset at 4:47 p.m. What was she carrying? Tom consulted his notes. Standard day pack, water, energy bars, rain gear, camera equipment. She had a PLB, personal locator beacon, but it hasn't been activated. That bothered David more than he wanted to admit. If Sarah was injured, lost, or in real trouble, why hadn't she triggered the beacon? "I'll head up the main trail," David said. "Can you coordinate with search and rescue? If I don't find her by noon, we'll need dogs." Tom nodded, but his expression shifted slightly. "David, you good for this? I know Sector 12 is... I'm fine. It's just after what happened with... I said I'm fine." David's voice came out harder than he intended. He softened it. 3 years is long enough, Tom. I can't avoid that section forever." Tom held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Okay. Radio check every 30 minutes. If you miss one, I'm sending the cavalry." The trail began in dense temperate rainforest, the kind that only existed in a few places on Earth. Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose overhead, their branches draped with club moss that hung like frozen waterfalls. David's boots made soft sounds on the needle-covered path, and his breath formed small clouds in the cold air. He'd forgotten how quiet it was here. Not silent. The forest was never truly silent, but muffled, as if sound itself had to wade through layers of damp air and ancient wood to reach him. At the 1-mile marker, he found Sarah's first trail marker. She'd used the old-school method, 3 rocks stacked in a cairn beside the path. David felt a small measure of respect. She'd been following protocol, leaving clear signs of her route. The second cairn appeared at the 2-mile point, exactly where it should be. The third cairn was at 3 miles, but something was wrong with it. The rocks were stacked, but they'd been arranged and then rearranged, as if someone had built it, knocked it down, and built it again. Beside it, pressed into the soft earth, was a boot print. Women's size 7, the tread pattern matching the Merrill Moabs that Sarah's husband had described. But there was something odd about the print. It was crisp, clear, as if it had been made minutes ago. But it had been raining last night and the ground was soft. There should have been water pooling in the impression. Instead, it was completely dry. David keyed his radio. Station 7 to dispatch. Go ahead, David. I'm at mile marker 3, found fresh tracks heading north toward Elk Lake, continuing pursuit. Copy that. How fresh? David looked at the print again, the impossible dryness of it. Very recent. If this story is holding your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in David's situation? Share your thoughts. At mile 4, the trail narrowed and began to climb more steeply. The fog was thicker here, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet. David moved carefully, his eyes scanning for more signs. That's when he heard it. Hello? A woman's voice coming from somewhere ahead and to the left off the main trail. David froze. Sarah? Sarah Chen? Yes, oh thank God I'm lost. I can't find the trail. Relief flooded through him, immediately followed by caution. Something felt wrong. Her voice was too clear, too close, but he couldn't see her through the fog. Stay where you are, David called. Keep talking so I can find you. I'm here, I'm right here. The voice was maybe 20 yards away, upslope. I just need to get back to the trail, I need to get home. David pushed through the undergrowth, ducking under low branches. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns and moss, everything wet and yielding under his boots. How long have you been out here? I'm not sure. What time is it? Almost 9 a.m. A pause. That can't be right. It was just getting dark a minute ago. David's hand tightened on his radio. Hypothermia could cause confusion, disorientation, but her voice was steady, not slurred. Sarah, are you hurt? Are you cold? No, I'm fine. I just need to find the trail. He pushed through a final curtain of branches and saw her. Sarah Chen stood in a small clearing, maybe 10 feet away. She was wearing exactly what her husband had described. Green rain jacket, black hiking pants, a blue pack on her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She looked completely normal, alert, healthy, not hypothermic. Except, she wasn't shivering. The temperature was 36 degrees. She'd been out all night, and she wasn't shivering. Sarah. David kept his voice calm, professional. I'm David, Forest Ranger. Your husband sent us to find you. You're going to be okay. She smiled, and it was a real smile, full of relief. Oh, thank God. I've been trying to find my way back for hours. The fog came in and everything looked the same. David approached slowly, his ranger training kicking in. Check for injuries, assess mental state, get her warm and get her out. But when he got close enough to really see her, his stomach dropped. Her jacket was completely dry, not damp, not wet from fog, bone dry, as if she'd been standing under a roof all night. Sarah, he said carefully, where exactly have you been since yesterday? I was checking the camera trap at Elk Lake. I got the footage I needed and started back, but the fog came in so fast I must have taken a wrong turn. She looked around, her expression uncertain. This doesn't look familiar. None of it looks familiar. David pulled out his GPS unit, but the fog was too thick, no satellite lock. He'd have to navigate by map and compass. Okay, the trail is about 20 yards that way. He pointed southwest. Let's get you back and warmed up. Do you need water? Food? No, I'm fine. I just want to go home. They started walking, David keeping her slightly ahead so he could watch her. Every instinct he'd developed over 15 years was screaming that something was wrong, but he couldn't identify what. She moved normally. Her speech was clear. She didn't seem to be in shock, but she wasn't cold, and her jacket was dry. Your husband is very worried about you, David said, watching her reaction. Sarah's expression softened. Marcus, is he here? He's at the ranger station. We'll get you to him soon. Good, he worries so much. I keep telling him I know these woods. She glanced back at David, and for just a moment, her eyes seemed to lose focus. I do know these woods, don't I? You're a researcher. You work here. Right. Yes. She touched her forehead as if trying to clear confusion. "I'm just tired. It was such a long night." They walked in silence for a few minutes. David kept checking his compass, keeping them on course toward the main trail. The fog pressed in from all sides, turning the forest into a gray maze. "David?" Sarah's voice was smaller now. "Yeah? Why is it so quiet?" He'd been thinking the same thing. The forest was never this silent. There should be birds, squirrels, the rustle of wind through branches. Instead, there was nothing except the soft sound of their boots on the trail and the occasional drip of water from the trees. "Fog dampens sound," he said. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't explanation enough. They reached what should have been the main trail, but something was wrong. The path that had been clear and well-maintained an hour ago was now overgrown, the vegetation pressing in from both sides. The trail markers were missing. David stopped, his pulse quickening. This wasn't right. Trails didn't change. Not like this. "Is this the way?" Sarah asked. "It doesn't look like the way." "Stay here." David moved forward, checking his compass again. Southwest. They were going the right direction, but the trail... He looked back at Sarah, and for just a second he saw something that made his heart stop. She was standing in a shaft of gray light that had broken through the fog, and in that light, he could see through her. Not completely, just the faintest translucence, like looking at someone through thin fabric. It lasted only a moment before the fog shifted, and she was solid again. David's mind raced. The sage in his pack, the elder's words. Some things don't leave. 3 years ago, in this same section of forest, he'd found a hiker named Michael Torres. Michael had been missing for 2 days, and when David found him, he'd been sitting at the base of an old cedar, completely still. "I'm waiting for someone to show me the way out," Michael had said. "She's been helping me." There had been no she. Michael had been alone. David had gotten him out, but Michael never spoke about what he'd seen in those 2 days. He'd just looked at David with hollow eyes and said, "She thought she was helping. She really did." Michael Torres had died 6 months later, drove his car off a cliff on Highway 101. The official report said it was an accident, but David had attended the funeral, and Michael's sister had pulled him aside. He kept saying he needed to go back, that she was still waiting for him, that she was so alone. Now David stood on an overgrown trail that shouldn't be overgrown, with a woman who cast a shadow but no body heat, and he understood what he was looking at. Sarah wasn't lost. Sarah was already gone. "Sarah," he said quietly, "tell me about yesterday. Start from the beginning." She turned to face him, and her expression was open, innocent. "I checked in at the ranger station. I remember that. The ranger was nice. He had a beard." "Tom. That was Tom." "Right, Tom. And then I hiked up to Elk Lake. It was a beautiful day. Clear skies." She paused, her brow furrowing. "But that's not right. It wasn't clear. It was foggy. Wasn't it foggy?" "What happened at the lake, Sarah?" "I checked the camera trap. The batteries were dead, so I replaced them. And then..." Her voice trailed off. "And then I heard someone calling for help." David's chest tightened. Who was calling? "I don't know." A woman's voice. She sounded scared. She said she was lost and couldn't find the trail. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "I tried to help her. I went looking for her." "Did you find her?" I don't remember. Everything after that is confused. It got dark so fast, and then I was trying to find my way back, but nothing looked right." She looked down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "David, why aren't I cold?" He'd been dreading that question. "Sarah, I need you to think carefully. When you went looking for that woman, did you fall? Did you hit your head?" "I don't think so. I don't remember falling." She touched her head. "I don't hurt anywhere." "Did you go into the lake?" "The lake?" She looked genuinely confused. "Why would I go into the lake? It's freezing." David pulled out his radio, keeping his voice steady. Station 7 to dispatch. Tom, you there? Static. Station 7 to dispatch, come in. More static. And then, faintly, Avid, Eek, copy. The radio was failing, or something was interfering with it. Sarah was watching him with growing concern. What's wrong? Why can't you reach them? Signal's bad in the fog. David clipped the radio back to his belt. He needed to think. The elder's words came back to him. Some things don't leave. And something else, something the old man had said while pressing the sage pouch into David's hand. They don't know what they are. To them, they're still alive, still trying to get home, but they can only show others the way they went. If Sarah was what David thought she was, if she had died somewhere on this mountain and her spirit was still walking, then following her would lead him to her body. But it would also lead him exactly where she had gone. Into the fog, into the confusion, into the same fate. Sarah, he said gently, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about the answer. Do you remember getting out of the lake? Her face went pale. I told you I didn't go in the lake. Then why are you dry? She looked down at her jacket, touched the fabric. It rained last night. Your jacket is completely dry. You've been out in fog thick enough to soak through clothes in an hour, and you're bone dry. That doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't. They stared at each other. David could see fear starting to build in her eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when reality begins to crack and show what's underneath. What are you saying? Her voice was barely a whisper. David had to choose his next words carefully. In his 15 years as a ranger, he'd learned that people in shock needed to be grounded in reality gently. But what reality was he supposed to ground her in? I think something happened at the lake. I think you might be hurt worse than you realize. But I feel fine. Sarah. I feel fine. She was getting agitated now, her hands trembling. I just want to go home. I just want to see Marcus. Can't you just show me the way back? She really thought she was helping Michael Torres had said about the woman who'd tried to lead him out. She didn't understand. David made his decision. He couldn't follow her, but he couldn't leave her either. Not like this, confused and alone, not understanding what she'd become. He unslung his pack and pulled out the leather pouch. His hands shook as he opened it, the smell of sage sharp in the damp air. What is that? Sarah asked. Something that might help. David's voice was thick. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget what happened with Michael Torres, trying to convince himself it had all been hypothermia and panic. Now he was holding sage blessed by a Kino elder who understood that some truths couldn't be explained by science. He struck a match, held it to the sage until it began to smolder. Sarah took a step back. What are you doing? Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't think you're lost. I think you've been trying to find your way back for a lot longer than you realize. What are you talking about? It's been a few hours. It's barely morning. Sarah, you disappeared yesterday afternoon. It's been nearly 19 hours. She shook her head violently. No, that's not right. It was just getting dark. And it got light again, and you didn't notice. The fog around them seemed to thicken, pressing closer. David held the smoking sage between them like a ward. I want to go home, Sarah said, and now her voice carried an edge of something desperate. Why won't you help me go home? I can't follow you home, Sarah, because the way you're going isn't out. It's deeper in. She was backing away from him now, her eyes wide. You're supposed to help me. You're a ranger. You're supposed to help people. I am helping you. Sarah, please. I think you went into the lake. I think something happened there. Nothing happened. Her voice echoed strangely in the fog, bouncing back from too many directions. I just want to find my way back. Why is everyone always lost? Why does no one ever know the way? David's breath caught. Everyone. Not, why am I lost? Everyone. Sarah, how many people have you tried to help? She went very still. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of water from the trees and the soft crackle of the smoking sage. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, confused. There was a man, a few days ago? Or was it longer? He said he was lost. I tried to show him the way, but he wouldn't follow me. He kept saying I wasn't real. Her eyes met David's, and in them he saw the first glimmer of terrible understanding. Was he right? David's throat tightened. Sarah, I think you need to stop trying to find your way back. I think you need to go forward. Forward where? I don't know, but somewhere other than this trail. Somewhere other than trying to get back to a place you can't reach anymore. Tears were streaming down her face now. I don't understand. I don't understand what's happening to me. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The fog was growing darker, denser. David could barely see her now, just her outline in the gray. Will you tell Marcus something for me? Her voice was fading. Of course. Tell him I tried to get home. Tell him I tried so hard. I will. And tell him. She paused. Tell him I understand now. Tell him I'm not lost anymore. The fog closed in completely, and when it cleared a moment later, Sarah was gone. David stood alone on the trail, the sage still smoking in his hand. He looked down and saw that the overgrown path had vanished. The main trail was back, clear and well-maintained, exactly as it had been an hour ago. His radio crackled. David? David, come in. You missed your check-in. What's your status? David's hand shook as he lifted the radio. This is David. I'm at mile marker 4. I need you to send the dive team to Elk Lake. The dive team? Did you find something? Not yet. But we will. They found Sarah Chen's body 3 hours later, 40 feet below the surface of Elk Lake. She'd fallen through thin ice at the north shore while trying to reach her camera trap, the cold water taking her quickly. The coroner estimated she'd died around 7 p.m. the previous night, about 12 hours before David had encountered her on the trail. The camera trap footage, recovered from her waterproof pack, showed her last moments. She'd been reaching for the camera when the ice gave way. The footage captured her breaking through, the shock of cold water, her struggles. And then, faintly, it picked up audio. Someone calling for help in the distance. A woman's voice, scared and lost. Sarah had been going toward that voice when she died. The technical team analyzed the audio, but they couldn't identify the source. Probably just wind through the trees, one of them said. Sound plays tricks up here. But David knew better. 2 weeks later, David stood in the Ho Ranger Station looking at the missing persons board. Sarah's picture had been taken down, replaced by a notification about a hiker who'd gone missing in Sector 12 last week. The hiker had been found after 2 days, confused and disoriented, claiming a woman in a green jacket had tried to lead him to safety, but kept taking him in circles. She seemed so real, the hiker had said. She kept saying she just needed to get home. David had gone back to Elk Lake after Sarah's body was recovered. He'd stood at the north shore where she'd fallen through the ice and burned sage there, the way the Quinault elder had taught him 3 years ago. He'd spoken words he barely understood, asking for peace, for release, for Sarah Chen to stop walking trails she could never complete. He didn't know if it had worked. He didn't know if anything could release someone who didn't understand they were already gone. What he did know was that Sector 12 would claim more searchers, more rangers, more people trying to help someone who appeared so real, so alive, so desperately lost. Because Sarah had been genuine in her confusion, real in her desire to help. She'd become what she'd encountered, someone trying to lead others home while having forgotten the way herself. David requested a transfer the next day. He was moving to Mount Baker, 200 miles north. Tom tried to talk him out of it. We need experienced rangers here, Tom said. especially ones who understand this place. That's exactly why I have to leave, David replied. Because I do understand. On his last day, David drove past the trailhead to Elk Lake one final time. The fog was rolling in early, thick and gray, and there, just visible at the edge of the parking area, he saw a figure in a green jacket. She was talking to a hiker, gesturing toward the trail, her expression helpful and kind. The hiker was nodding, shouldering his pack, clearly grateful for the local knowledge. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He could stop. He could warn the hiker. He could try to intervene. But what would he say? That the woman helping him was dead? That following her would lead him into the same fog, the same confusion, the same fate? The hiker wouldn't believe him. No one ever did. Not until it was too late. David drove away, watching in his rearview mirror as the hiker followed Sarah Chen into the fog. The smoke from burning sage still lingered in his truck, but David knew now that some things couldn't be cleansed with ritual. Some spirits were trapped not by malevolence but by the purest of intentions. The simple desire to help, to guide, to lead others to safety. Sarah Chen had been a good person. She still was, in whatever remained of her. She was still trying to help. That was what made it so much worse. Thank you for reading until the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of Sarah's fate? I'd love to read your theories in the comments.